Everybody, welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We are the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm John Kennedy.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
So today we have come to the last piece of Markan Scripture that we're going to have in this year. And Jesus is a prophet of doom, which is bad news for the people in Jesus' day and good news for the people in Mark's day. Let's take a look at the scripture. This is Mark 13, verses 1 to 8. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones or what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Okay, so here we are. We are at the conclusion of Jesus' temple teachings. We are at the beginning of the little apocalypse, or the Olivet Discourse, and Jesus walks out of the temple.
Well, prophet of doom indeed, right? And I hope we will get to what you claimed at the beginning, that this was bad news for the people of Jesus' day and good news for the people of Mark's day. But first, I think the thing to underscore here is that this is everything Jesus says here, that Jesus begins to say here, because this will continue for the rest of Mark chapter 13. We're only getting the beginning. It's in response to a question about the temple, or rather, comments made about the temple that leads Jesus to say the temple will be destroyed, and four of his disciples asking, when will this be? So before interpretation launches ahead or doesn't to end times, which is, I think, the most common frame for interpreting this passage among Christians, it should begin with, it being a conversation or a monologue anyway about the temple.
Yeah, it follows the passage that we had the week before about the widow in the temple, and Jesus sitting opposite the treasury in the temple, and things aren't going so well in his view of the temple there either. And now they're outside, and he's sort of mentioning how it will be destroyed, and it's so extraordinary. I mean, you know better than most of us that if you go to the Wailing Wall, those stones, or the size of the stones, are still visible at the bottom of that wall, and they were in awe of this huge structure. And for Jesus to say, no stone will be left on top of another, they're like, what? How can that possibly be? But I feel like this, Ched Myers, who I've read a lot about, he writes that book about discipleship in Mark. He says that this passage, Mark 13, alludes to events in Mark's own historical moment, that, the Judean revolt of 66 to 70 was this incredibly volatile, violent, back and forth time between Jewish insurgents and the Roman armies. And it went back and forth, and it was really volatile. And so Mark's writing to people who were living during that time, and Jesus is talking to them about Mark has Jesus instructing them about how to carry themselves in the midst of all this violence.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that Mark's compilation of the scriptural pieces, or what we now say is scriptural pieces, is a pastoral letter to his people. And that as this begins the apocalyptic literature, the purpose of all apocalyptic literature is pastoral. It's to have people endure suffering. But I would also go back to, bad news in Jesus' day. And this is, there's so many lenses to see this, but that the prediction here of the destruction of the temple is predictive prophecy that does come true. And even the signs that Jesus says are in between, those signs actually do come true. I mean, we do have signs of what you're saying, of wars. We know of famines. Josephus talks about these sorts of things. We have histories that go through, and you can tick down, and every one of the things that Jesus says actually does come true. And this is, of course, we're having a conversation, which I just want to make sure all of those following us know that the 40 years after Jesus says this, the temple is in fact destroyed. I just want to get that, make sure that's understood.
Yeah, most definitely. So we've put the word, I think, apocalyptic on the table, and I think that is absolutely key here for understanding the idiom that Jesus is speaking in. That by Jesus' lifetime, this was a well-established Jewish genre. Certainly in the book of Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament is a straight-up apocalyptic book from start to finish, and with some narrative in there. But we also get elements of that in many of the prophets, perhaps quite notably Zechariah, which is one of the closing texts of the Hebrew Bible, has some very apocalyptic imagery and ideas, and apocalyptic is often, perhaps most often, heard as being in reference to concerning last things, the end of the world in some way. And, reading the scriptures, the apocalyptic scriptures, there's certainly, I think, clear validity to that, but it doesn't say everything about what that genre is and how it works. As you said, Peter, it's pastoral. It's written to encourage the people of God to endure suffering, firmly grounded in a deeper and broader and sustaining hope for God's ultimate triumph, and therefore the delivery of God's people throughout all sorts of suffering and persecution. And it's written with reference not only to like last things, but any sort of tribulation that happens in the midst of history that people find themselves in.
I'm struck by how, in the passage we have the disciples kind of already buying into this, end time sort of belief system that they think that Jesus is saying to them, these are signs of the end times, like the temple come down and like we do so much today, interpret this, not we, but many groups interpret it as an end times passage, meaning the end of the world, and then we'll all enter into the heavenly ever after in bliss, But here the disciples are making this connection between, when will this be and what will be the sign that this is all going to be accomplished or come to an end? And Jesus doesn't answer that question at all. He's giving them their instruction. I'm so struck that Mark has the eyes to say this in his context, that he clearly, the community got it after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, that they were supposed to stand firm during this time and not get into the fray militarily, and that Jesus later in Mark 13, cautions them about getting involved, and like Daniel cautions the people 2 centuries earlier not to, to resist both the imperialists and the military nationalists. I mean, that's the same type of context they have during Mark's day between Romans and Jewish temple defenders and stuff like that. But I'm amazed at their maturity in their Christian discipleship, that they actually have this message circulating in their community. So soon after the disciples themselves didn't get it. I mean, clearly they did after Jesus rose, but I love that. I guess I'm not sure if I'm being clear, but they were so model disciples right away. They really did resist, because the rest is history. They went on to emerge as this enormous movement and survive it and pass it on to the rest of us. So Jesus instructs his first disciples, but also us. The world hasn't changed at all. These things are, as Jesus says, they must take place. They always take place. The cycles of violence are never going to solve and bring an end, but Jesus ushers in a future end, a different end, which is, the kingdom of God. And we have to watch for it and stay grounded and keep our focus on that. So I guess I'm just impressed that Mark's community has this intact, and it's so clear in the passage to me.
It's interesting. I think that we as Christians I won't speak for everybody, wildly underestimate the import of this passage, but from a different perspective. So that it would be inconceivable that the temple would be destroyed. If you go to the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall now, that's 75 feet high. As you know, there's 75 feet down below the earth. I spoke about this last time I did a podcast. But the temple itself was 150 feet high. So that's 150 feet plus 150 feet, and the stones of these things. Josephus talks about the size of these stones. This is a place of great enormity. But I think that the theology here, something, Elizabeth, you've spoken a little bit about in the past, which is the temple theology. You go there to meet God. And that the new theology here is in Jesus being the new temple, and you don't go to Jesus. I mean, you go to Jesus to meet God. He's the new temple, and the difference is you don't go to the temple comes to you. But that at the risk of speaking too long, I just want to share something that I think that is really important. This is still impacting our life today. The location of the Temple Mount, had two temples on it. We know that Solomon's temple from 1000 BC. Then the second temple appeared in 400, and then Herod, 50 years before Jesus' day, rebuilt the temple into this incredible place. In Jesus' day, it was everything. It's the symbolic center for religion, politics, the whole nation. It's all those things wrapped into one. Not to move really quickly, but to move really quickly, we have a Muslim invasion that comes in and takes over the holy city, Jerusalem, followed by the Crusades that come back, and then up to 1949 with the state of Israel. And just to say what is going on there now, the Temple Mount is how the Jewish body refers to it, and the people of Islam, Haram el-Sharif, which means a noble sanctuary, and which is overseen by Jordan. And there are two mosques on that, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Western Wall, the so-called Wailing Wall, is the most holy site in Judaism because it's as close as you can get. And Christians have no claim on any of this because we have Jesus as the new temple. And in fact, while we were in control, the Christians were in control, they turned it into a garbage dump. But because we turned it into a garbage dump is why we're not involved in the holy war that is happening in the Middle East right now as Christians. And you may have been watching that the horrors of October 7th, Hamas named that the Al-Aqsa flood after the most important monument, the most important mosque on the top there. And it said that the reason for the Al-Aqsa flood was because there's a group of Israelis, Jewish Israeli citizens, who are seeking to create a third temple on their holy site. And so this place that Jesus announces is going to be the destruction, is going to be destroyed, is still rippling through our world with war and destruction. And what Jesus is offering is an alternative sense of divine reality. But for the Jewish people and for our Abrahamic brothers and sisters and siblings, this has a completely different energy center to it. And so the import of Jesus saying he's walking out of the temple, he's leaving that behind, and he is going to become the new thing. That is why we are not plugged in at the same level that the rest of these our Abrahamic siblings are. It's a big deal that what he's talking about here.
I'm impressed, Elizabeth, by what you said about being impressed, right, by the disciples, the Markan community as probably representative of the early Christian community, at least who are reading, the canonical Gospels that we have, and Peter, what you said by Jesus proposing and really providing and modeling an alternative way to the territorial, tribal, religious conflict that still engulfs that part of the world today. It's really, really remarkable for me, especially in light of what I think Jesus is saying here, which is that the coming destruction of the temple will be, of course, as far as human agency goes, a result of Roman forces, right? The occupier, but also an expression of divine judgment against the sort of religiosity within his own culture, among his own people, that both sought to deal with an imperial occupying force such as Rome militarily, even though it couldn't possibly win. I mean, it's just foolish beyond description. And second of all, oppressed and marginalized too many of its own people. These are the people that Jesus drew near to again and again in the gospel narrative up until this point. It's the woman, the widow, making her offering in the treasury. It's the woman with the hemorrhage. It's blind Bartimaeus. It's all these people who were looked over, cast aside, and sometimes exploited and oppressed by Jesus' own religious establishment. And this theme of a foreign invading force such as Babylon acting as some sort of strange agent of divine judgment and justice is very much a biblical, Hebrew Bible theme. So it's sort of a tough pill to swallow, but I think it's very much there. And I think it highlights all the more what it means for Jesus to call his people, the new people of God constituted around him as the new temple, into a very different way that really kind of just walks away from this violence and this sort of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think Jesus really, apocalypse also means revelation. It means the showing, revealing. And I feel like Jesus is speaking the language of his time in this genre, inheriting Daniel and all their history. And, when we talk about catastrophes in our time, we say it's earth-shattering. We talk in the same kind of idioms of apocalyptic talk, and it's not that we mean the latest hurricane is the end of the world, but it's earth-shattering, shatter the earth. That's an apocalyptic phrase. So I think Jesus talks in that language. His whole life is an apocalypse. It's a revelation of how God actually is. And I do believe that the Hebrew Bible conveys a violent divine agency, that God, takes vengeance or sends in the Babylon, or, there's human interpretations of human violence that attribute it to the divine force. And we continue to do that, but Jesus never does that. And I don't think he's doing that here. And he never defends himself. And I think he's trying to instruct his disciples not to get caught up in the fervors of human violence, because they are not the way of Jesus and they're not a solution. And they have nothing to do with what it means to enter into the kingdom of God. And if anything, the kingdom of God is here to help us put an end to that by revealing what these things are actually meaning, which is they mean nothing divine, they mean everything human about our anthropology. We create order in society by violence, and God has a different order for us in mind.
Yeah, there's some super heavy stuff here. With the question of prophecy, you were noting Ezekiel and Daniel and the prophets of doom of the temple, and what does that mean in God's is God using secular forces to carry out this punishment. God is a divine punisher. And then Jesus, what you're holding up to us is the whole way of who Jesus was and what he taught as a different hermeneutic, a different understanding, and of how we, of the apocalypse, of the revelation, of the divine revelation. What does that mean? And I do think that the question of how we interpret the scriptures and how we interpret God and how we interpret particular passages is of the greatest importance to the life of the world, because when we use God to propel violence, it supercharges this violence that we as human beings might be a part of, and it's terrifyingly terrible. And the other day I was listening to something again, my jogging is chugging, but it's super slow. But I go so slowly, I need to be entertained. And I got listening to this Scottish preacher who's so great. And he was saying that the primary problem that people make with golf, I love this, Father John's father is a celebrated golf pro, is that they get their alignment wrong. So even if they swing perfectly, they just hit the ball in the wrong direction. Numero uno problem with this pastor priest. And that's the same thing can be said about about biblical hermeneutics. People get their alignment wrong. And so when they look at the passage, they misinterpret the passages, and therefore where their shot lands is way off. And so I think when we get involved with this apocalyptic literature, this literature that involves violence, we have to be super, super careful about how we align and what lens, what hermeneutic, what interpretation, hermeneutic, the Greek word for interpretation, interpreter, how we interpret this, and whether or not we're putting on the revelation, the apocalypse of we understand it of Jesus, or whether or not we're putting on another revelatory glasses, and we might end up in very different places.
Yeah, no, I think we have to be very, very careful with the interpretation of violent sounding texts like these. I'm a bit more hesitant to posit sort of a divide between God as God appears in certainly the prophets of the Old Testament. I'll just put my cards on the table that I still have not figured out how to square the depiction of God in, let's say, the book of Joshua with much of God in the rest of the Bible. But when it comes to the prophets, because Jesus was a prophet, and that was sort of his tradition, I'm very hesitant to posit a divide between the characterization of God in the prophets and the God that Jesus, knew as Father. And I think that it's very possible to recognize a divine prerogative for, decreeing judgment in the various ways that God is said to in the scriptures. And kind of leaving that as God's prerogative. God is mysterious. God is so many things that we are not. We are just not God. Jesus shows us what it looks like to live perfectly in communion with God as a human being, and that means always choosing peace. And in fact, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the prophets, the reason why the prophets are saying God is going to, let's say, send in the Babylonians, basically, to destroy Jerusalem, among other judgments that are talked about in the scriptures, is because the people of God, the people of Israel, have failed to walk in the ways that God has called them to walk in, which are precisely ways of justice and peace and taking care of those who are in need, those who are vulnerable, welcoming the stranger, the alien. So it has everything to do with, in other words, divine judgment in the scriptures has everything to do with the call of the people to live as people of justice, right? Because judgment and justice are absolutely corollary terms. So my personal way of sort of handling this sort of thing is, first of all, I'm not big on vengeance and divine judgment. If I could wave a wand and just sort of take this theme, this element out of the scriptures, I would be tempted to do it. I'm not saying I would do it because that would be rather bold, but I would be tempted. But given that it's there, I'm sort of with Paul in his exhortation to, I think it's in the Romans, to the Christians to, be at peace, love their enemies, and leave vengeance to the Lord. Just sort of, recognize that as the divine prerogative. And just to finally, close this little riff with something I think is very important, at least for how I think about this, is that any sense of divine judgment and punishment, I think that certainly that we see in the prophets and in the New Testament, is precisely in service of bringing about God's purpose for the earth, which is justice, which is peace, which is harmony, which is shalom, right? And that I think there is this very biblical, apocalyptic, prophetic sense of a great shaking of things in this present age, in this present order, that for whatever reason, birth pangs that come before the birth of the new creation, which is not a flight into a disembodied afterlife, but is the restoration of the world that we have here. So I really wrestle with this stuff too, but that's kind of where I come down on it.
Yeah, nice.
Mm-hmm. I won't give up too easily, because I think that if we left vengeance to the Lord in every case, we would find that God does not take vengeance. And it's human violence in every instance where we see violence, human against human. And just because the ancient scriptures are written in a certain way with a certain point of view doesn't mean that God literally wielded the violence willingly. And you know, I think there's an evolution of human revelation, human understanding of God through the scriptures. And the prophets are always representing that aspect of God. You know, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And all I require of you is to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. And it's a refrain throughout the prophets. And in Isaiah, we get the suffering servant. We get the embodiment of the suffering servant in Jesus, who goes all the way defenselessly to the cross to reveal what we're doing. You know, we're human, violent creatures. And so I'll still work to articulate better in my life how I come to understand that God has no part in violence, and that Jesus breaking in, you know, as divine presence among us and living and dying as he did, coming back to forgive, leading us through violent times that we lived through, that Mark's community lived through, not getting into the fray, not taking up arms, not siding with one or the other, because we're supposed to testify to a gospel of peace and nonviolence and inclusion and forgiveness, and will be persecuted by both sides for not taking sides. I mean, that was his way. And it's so hard that we hardly ever do it. And we don't like that idea because it's not expedient, and we've been guided into thinking that one side's better than another when two sides are at war. So that's where I continue to struggle mightily to really have words, but I just feel so convicted about it.
Thank you to both of you and each of you for that. Really well said in each case. And I think that we find ourselves in a conversation, and I refer everybody here who's been listening to us, that we've wandered into some. We went into some areas that might not be as clear unless you read the whole of chapter 13 in Mark's Gospel.
True.
Because it's
hard to break it up.
What we have here, yes, is a unified document, that a unified passage. I mean, chapter 13, you could yank it right out of the Gospel and keep right on going and seem like you didn't miss anything. So it's a teaching dropped in, and there's a lot of biblical scholarship around that. But in order to understand its interconnectedness, you'd have to kind of take on the whole thing. And our lectionary takes on just the one thing, just the destruction of the temple. And if you come to church, if you stream our church on the Sunday, none of the three of us are going to sort this out, because we're bringing in a higher power. We're bringing in the Reverend Maggie Dawn, who we're super psyched is going to come be our guest preacher. She is going to be leading our women's retreat. For those of you who do not know Maggie, you are in for a treat. She's a singer-songwriter who is musical in every part of her being. She's an Episcopal priest. She's a professor of theology in Durham University in England. She's the theologian in residence in Rhode Island, and formerly of the Yale Divinity School, and a friend of St. Mark's. And I hope if you'll tune in with us, you'll see that she's a friend of yours too. So God bless each of you and both of you, and Rob behind the camera with his New York Jets jersey on, hoping for a victory. And we love it when you like and subscribe and do everything you can to pass the word. So peace be with you. God bless you. Take care.